The funeral director's words echoed in Marcus's ears as he stared at the twin caskets. "I'm sorry for your loss. The insurance paperwork will be handled by your designated beneficiary." Marcus nodded numbly, assuming the man meant both him and his older brother Daniel. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, sitting in his cramped studio apartment with eviction notices piling up on his kitchen table, that he realized how wrong he had been. The call from Hartwell Insurance would shatter everything he thought he knew about family loyalty. But that revelation was still months away. For now, Marcus Chen was just a 19-year-old community college student trying to figure out how to survive without the two people who had been his entire world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hadn't stopped falling since the accident. Marcus pressed his face against the cold window of his studio apartment, watching droplets race down the glass like the tears he'd been holding back for days. Across the city, in the sprawling suburban home they'd all shared just a month ago, his brother Daniel was probably sitting in their father's leather chair, feet up on the mahogany coffee table their mother had treasured. The thought made Marcus's chest tighten with a familiar ache of displacement. Their parents, Helen and Robert Chen, had died instantly when a drunk driver ran a red light at the intersection of Pine and Maple. The impact had been so severe that the coroner told them there had been no suffering, a small mercy that did little to ease the hollow ache in Marcus's chest. Helen had been a kindergarten teacher for 15 years, beloved by hundreds of children who would never understand why Mrs. Chen wouldn't be there to help them learn their letters. Robert had worked as an electrical engineer, the kind of steady, methodical NAM who fixed everything from broken toasters to complex circuit boards with the same patient precision. They had been driving home from Marcus's community college graduation ceremony, the backseat still filled with congratulatory flowers and a cake that would never be eaten. Marcus remembered his mother's proud smile as she'd taken endless photos, embarrassing him in front of his classmates. His father had been quieter, but Marcus had caught him wiping away tears during the ceremony. They had planned to celebrate at home with Daniel, who had promised to cook his famous stir-fry despite his busy schedule at the consulting firm where he worked. Daniel was 26, 7 years older than Marcus, and had always been the responsible one. While Marcus struggled through community college, changing majors twice and barely maintaining passing grades, Daniel had graduated summa cum laude from UC Berkeley with a business degree and immediately landed a position at Morrison & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious consulting firms. He drove a BMW, wore tailored suits, and had a corner office with a view of the bay. Their parents had been equally proud of both sons, but Marcus always felt like he was running to catch up to Daniel's shadow. After the funeral, Daniel had naturally taken charge of everything. He handled the obituary, coordinated with the cemetery, managed the endless stream of casseroles from neighbors and colleagues. Marcus had been grateful for Daniel's efficiency during those first chaotic days, still too numb with grief to handle practical matters. When Daniel suggested that Marcus move out of the family home temporarily while they sorted through their parents' belongings, it had seemed reasonable. The house held too many memories anyway, and Marcus's studio apartment near campus was already paid through the end of the semester. "Just until we figure everything out," Daniel had said, his voice gentle but firm. "The house needs work, and you need space to grieve. Trust me, little brother, I've got this handled." Marcus had nodded, accepting the decision like he'd accepted most of Daniel's decisions throughout their lives. Daniel was the planner, the organizer, the one who thought 3 steps ahead. If Daniel said temporary, then temporary it would be. But temporary had stretched into weeks, and weeks were becoming months. Every time Marcus called to discuss coming home, Daniel had a new reason why it wasn't quite the right time yet. The roof needed repairs after the recent storms. The heating system was acting up. He was having the hardwood floors refinished. Each excuse sounded reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Marcus's financial situation was becoming desperate. His part-time job at the campus bookstore barely covered his rent and groceries, and without his parents' support, he was struggling to afford even basic necessities. His car had been making ominous grinding noises for weeks, but he couldn't afford to take it to a mechanic. His laptop, essential for his classes, had a cracked screen that he'd been covering with tape. The eviction notice on his kitchen table was his final warning. Pay 2 months back rent within 10 days or lose his apartment. He had assumed that his parents' life insurance would provide some relief. Helen and Robert were responsible people who planned for contingencies. Robert had mentioned life insurance policies multiple times over the years, usually in the context of encouraging Marcus to be more financially responsible. "Your mother and I won't be around forever," he'd said during one of their talks about Marcus's career uncertainty. "But we've made sure you and Daniel will be taken care of if anything happens to us." The phrase haunted Marcus now. Taken care of. Yet here he was, eating ramen noodles for the 3rd night in a row and wondering if he should drop out of school to work full-time just to keep a roof over his head. When he'd asked Daniel about the insurance money, his brother had been vague. "These things take time," Daniel had explained over coffee at a downtown cafe, checking his phone while he spoke. "There's paperwork, probate court, all sorts of bureaucratic nonsense. The lawyers are handling it. Don't worry, Marcus. When it's all sorted out, we'll both be fine." But Marcus was starting to worry. It had been almost 3 months since the accident, and he hadn't seen a single document or heard from any lawyer directly. All communication seemed to flow through Daniel, who parceled out information in carefully measured doses. When Marcus pressed for specifics, Daniel would change the subject or reassure him with the same vague platitudes about patience and proper procedures. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in November. Marcus was sitting in his macroeconomics class, trying to focus on supply and demand curves, when his phone buzzed with a text message from his landlord. Final notice: pay by Friday or eviction proceedings begin Monday. After class, Marcus drove to Daniel's office building, a gleaming tower of steel and glass, in the financial district. The lobby was all marble and modern art, the kind of intimidating corporate space that made Marcus acutely aware of his worn jeans and thrift store jacket. The receptionist, a polished woman with perfect makeup, looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain when he asked to see Daniel Chen. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her tone suggesting that people like Marcus typically didn't visit people like Daniel without jumping through proper bureaucratic hoops. "He's my brother," Marcus replied, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "It's a family emergency." The woman's expression softened slightly, and she made a phone call. A few minutes later, Daniel appeared in the lobby, looking every inch the successful consultant in his charcoal suit and silk tie. But his face was tight with annoyance as he approached Marcus. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice low. "I'm in the middle of a client presentation." "I need to talk to you about the insurance money. My landlord is threatening eviction. I can't wait any longer for the bureaucratic nonsense to sort itself out."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Daniel glanced around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation happening in his professional space. "This isn't the place, Marcus. Can't this wait until tonight?" "No, it can't wait," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "I need answers now. What lawyers are you talking about? What paperwork? Why haven't I seen anything official?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Lower your voice. You're being dramatic, just like always." The phrase hit Marcus like a physical blow. Dramatic had been Daniel's go-to dismissal throughout their childhood whenever Marcus complained about anything. Dramatic when he cried after Daniel broke his favorite toy. Dramatic when he protested Daniel eating his Halloween candy. Dramatic when he felt left out of Daniel's plans with older friends. "I'm not being dramatic," Marcus said quietly. "I'm being evicted. I need to know what's happening with our parents' life insurance." Daniel sighed heavily, as if Marcus were a particularly tiresome child. "Fine, meet me at my house tonight at 7. We'll go through everything then." But when Marcus arrived at the family home that evening, Daniel wasn't there. The house was dark, Daniel's BMW nowhere to be seen. Marcus sat in his car for 2 hours, calling Daniel's phone repeatedly and getting voicemail each time. When Daniel finally answered at nearly 10 o'clock, he claimed to have forgotten about their meeting. "Something urgent came up at work," Daniel said, his voice distracted. "Reschedule for this weekend." That weekend came and went with another cancellation, then another. Each time, Daniel had a perfectly reasonable excuse: work crisis, client emergency, out-of-town conference. Marcus began to feel like he was chasing shadows, always one step behind his brother's increasingly elaborate schedule of important commitments that somehow never included helping his grieving younger brother navigate their parents' estate. The pattern continued for weeks. Daniel would agree to meet, then cancel at the last minute. He would promise to call with updates, then disappear for days at a time. When Marcus managed to pin him down for brief conversations, Daniel's explanations became increasingly vague and defensive. The lawyers were being thorough. The insurance company was being cautious. Everything was proceeding normally, just slowly. Marcus's situation continued to deteriorate. He was forced to drop 2 of his classes when he couldn't afford the textbooks. His car finally broke down completely, leaving him dependent on unreliable public transportation. He lost his job at the bookstore when he was late too many times due to bus delays. The eviction notice was replaced by court papers, and Marcus found himself Googling "homeless shelters near me" on the cracked screen of his dying laptop. It was during this lowest point, 3 days before he was scheduled to be legally removed from his apartment, that Marcus made a desperate decision. If Daniel wouldn't give him information about their parents' insurance policies, maybe he could find the information himself. He knew where their parents had kept their important documents, a fireproof safe in their bedroom closet. He also knew the combination, their anniversary date, because his father had made him memorize it just in case. Marcus waited until he was sure Daniel wouldn't be home, then used his key to enter the house he'd grown up in. It felt strange and wrong to be sneaking into his own family home, but Daniel's evasiveness had left him no choice. The house still smelled like their mother's lavender candles and their father's coffee, scents that made Marcus's eyes water as he climbed the stairs to his parents' bedroom. The safe was exactly where it always had been, tucked behind his mother's winter coats. Marcus's hands shook as he entered the combination, half expecting it to have been changed, but the heavy door swung open with a soft click, revealing neat stacks of documents organized in his father's methodical way. Birth certificates, marriage certificate, house deed, car titles, and there, in a manila folder labeled insurance, the policies Marcus had been seeking for months. What he found made his blood run cold. There were, indeed, life insurance policies, substantial ones, each worth $500,000. But as Marcus read through the documents with growing horror, he realized that sometime in the past year, both policies had been modified. The original beneficiaries had been Helen Chen and Robert Chen's children, Marcus Chen and Daniel Chen, in equal shares. But recent amendments, signed just 6 months before the accident, had changed the designation to Daniel Chen, sole beneficiary. The signatures looked like his parents' handwriting, but something felt wrong about them. His father's signature was usually sharp and precise, reflecting his engineering background. These signatures were slightly different, looser somehow, as if someone had been trying to copy an unfamiliar style. His mother's signature showed similar discrepancies, lacking the characteristic flourish she always added to the H in Helen. Marcus photographed every page with his phone, his mind racing. Had his parents really decided to leave everything to Daniel? It seemed impossible. They had always emphasized fairness between their sons, always made sure Marcus didn't feel overshadowed by Daniel's achievements. When they'd given Daniel money for his first apartment, they'd opened a savings account for Marcus with an equal amount. When they helped pay for Daniel's senior year of college, they'd done the same for Marcus's community college tuition. But the evidence was right there, in black and white. According to these documents, Daniel was entitled to $1 million in life insurance benefits, while Marcus was entitled to nothing. As Marcus sat on his parents' bedroom floor, surrounded by the documents that had shaped their lives, he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe his parents had planned to set up a trust for Marcus, or maybe they'd intended to make additional changes that they hadn't completed before the accident. Maybe Daniel was managing the money responsibly, waiting for the right time to share it with his younger brother. But even as Marcus tried to rationalize what he had found, a darker possibility gnawed at him. What if Daniel had known about these policy changes all along? What if his delays and excuses hadn't been about bureaucratic complications, but about hiding the fact that Marcus had been completely cut out of their parents' legacy? The thought was so painful that Marcus physically doubled over, gasping for breath. The brother that he'd looked up to his entire life, the person that he'd trusted to handle their family's affairs with integrity, might have been lying to him for months.
While Marcus had been struggling to afford food and facing homelessness, Daniel had potentially been sitting on $1 million inheritance that legally belonged to him alone. Marcus carefully returned all the documents to the safe, but he kept the photos on his phone. He needed time to think, to figure out what to do with this information. Confronting Daniel directly seemed pointless, given his months of evasion. Going to a lawyer would cost money Marcus didn't have. But maybe there were other options, other people who might have insight into what had happened. The next morning, Marcus called his parents' insurance company directly. He'd found the contact information in the policy documents, and after being transferred through several departments, he reached a claims representative named Patricia Williamson. "I'm calling about the life insurance policies for Helen and Robert Chen," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "They were my parents. They died in a car accident 3 months ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Patricia said, her voice professionally sympathetic. "Can you provide me with the policy numbers and your relationship to the insured parties?" Marcus read off the numbers from his photos and explained that he was the deceased couple's son. There was a pause as Patricia pulled up the files on her computer. "I see here that the claims have been processed and benefits have been paid out," she said. "Is there something specific you need help with?" "I was wondering about the beneficiary designation," Marcus said carefully. "I thought both of the deceased's sons were supposed to be beneficiaries, but I haven't received any communication from your company." Another pause, longer this time. "According to our records, Daniel Chen was listed as the sole beneficiary on both policies. The benefits were paid out to him 6 weeks ago." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. 6 weeks ago. While Marcus had been begging Daniel for information about when the insurance money might be available, Daniel had already received and presumably spent or invested $1 million. "Is there any record of when the beneficiary designations were changed?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let me check," Patricia said. Marcus could hear typing in the background. "The modifications were processed 11 months ago. The new beneficiary forms were submitted with what appeared to be valid signatures from both policyholders." 11 months ago? Marcus tried to remember what had been happening in his family's life at that time. It was around the time he'd been struggling academically, considering dropping out of community college entirely. His parents had been worried about his future, disappointed by his lack of direction. Daniel had been thriving at work, recently promoted to senior consultant. It would have been natural for his parents to have concerns about leaving money to Marcus, who had a track record of poor financial decisions and no clear career path. But even if his parents had doubts about Marcus's readiness to handle an inheritance, it seemed impossible that they would have cut him out entirely without at least discussing it with him. His mother especially had always been adamant about treating her sons equally, about not letting Daniel's success overshadow Marcus's potential. "Is there a way to verify the signatures on those beneficiary change forms?" Marcus asked. Patricia's tone became more cautious. "Is there some reason you believe there might have been irregularities with the paperwork?" Marcus hesitated. Accusing his brother of insurance fraud was a serious allegation, one that could have devastating consequences for Daniel's career and freedom. But Marcus was facing his own devastating consequences, potentially including homelessness, based on what seemed to be a systematic deception. "I just want to make sure everything was handled properly." My parents never mentioned changing their beneficiaries, and it seems out of character for them to exclude one of their children entirely. I understand your concern, said Patricia. If you'd like to file a formal inquiry, I can transfer you to our fraud investigation department. They would need to review the original documents and potentially have the signatures analyzed by handwriting experts. Marcus's heart raced. A fraud investigation would mean official scrutiny, legal procedures, potential criminal charges if irregularities were found. It would also mean irreparably damaging his relationship with Daniel, assuming there was anything left to salvage. What would happen if the investigation found problems with the signatures? Marcus asked. If evidence of fraud were discovered, the benefits would be frozen pending legal resolution. The matter would likely be referred to law enforcement, and any fraudulent benefits would need to be returned to the company for proper redistribution according to the original policy terms. Marcus closed his eyes, weighing his options. He could file the inquiry and potentially expose Daniel's deception, if that's what it was. Or he could let it go, accept that his parents had chosen to leave everything to Daniel for reasons he might never understand, and try to rebuild his life from nothing. I need to think about this, Marcus said. Can I call you back? Of course, Patricia replied, but I should mention that there are time limits on these types of inquiries. If you're going to file a formal complaint, it's better to do it sooner rather than later. After ending the call, Marcus sat in his nearly empty apartment, surrounded by boxes of belongings he'd have to put in storage because he couldn't afford to move them to wherever he'd be living next week. The weight of his discovery pressed down on him like a physical force. His brother, the person he'd trusted most after their parents' death, had potentially stolen his inheritance and watched him face homelessness without offering any help. But there was still a part of Marcus that hoped for an innocent explanation. Maybe Daniel was planning to share the money but wanted to invest it first. Or maybe he was waiting for Marcus to demonstrate more financial responsibility. Maybe the signature discrepancies were just natural variations. Or maybe their parents really had decided that Daniel was the more suitable beneficiary. That evening, Marcus called his brother one more time, deciding to give his brother a chance to come clean before taking any official action. Daniel answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted and slightly annoyed. Marcus, what's up? I'm in the middle of something important. I need to ask you a direct question, Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. Have you received any money from our parents' life insurance policies? The silence that followed was answer enough, but Daniel eventually spoke. Why are you asking me that? Because I called the insurance company today. They told me that you were listed as the sole beneficiary and that you received the benefits 6 weeks ago. Another long pause. When Daniel finally responded, his voice had changed, becoming colder and more defensive. Look, Marcus, this is complicated.
There are things you don't understand about our parents' financial situation. Then explain it to me, Marcus said. Explain why I've been facing eviction while you've been sitting on $1 million that might rightfully belong to both of us. Rightfully? Daniel's voice rose. Do you have any idea how much money our parents spent on you over the years? All those times you dropped classes and wasted their tuition money? All those get-rich-quick schemes you needed startup funding for? All those times you borrowed money from them and never paid it back? They were tired of throwing good money after bad, Marcus. They wanted to make sure their life insurance actually accomplished something productive. The words stung because there was truth in them. Marcus had made financial mistakes, had disappointed his parents more than once. But the cruelty in Daniel's voice, the casual dismissal of Marcus's worth, was devastating. So they decided to leave me nothing? Marcus asked quietly. Not even enough to finish school or get back on my feet? They decided to trust me to make good decisions with their money, Daniel replied. And one of those decisions was not enabling your pattern of irresponsibility. By lying to me for months? By watching me face homelessness while you know exactly what resources are available? I didn't lie, Daniel said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I said the paperwork was complicated, and it was. I said these things take time, and they do. I never promised you anything. Marcus felt something break inside him, a final thread of trust and familial loyalty snapping under the weight of Daniel's callousness. Did our parents really change those beneficiary designations, or did you forge their signatures? The question hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. When Daniel finally responded, his voice was ice cold. Be very careful what you're suggesting, Marcus. Accusing someone of fraud is a serious matter. You might want to think about whether you can afford the legal consequences of making false allegations. The implied threat was clear. Daniel had resources, connections, legal knowledge from his business training. Marcus had nothing but suspicions and a cracked phone screen full of photographs that might or might not prove anything. I'm not making allegations, Marcus said quietly. I'm asking my brother if he forged our parents' signatures to steal my inheritance. This conversation is over, Daniel said. Don't contact me again unless it's through a lawyer. And Marcus, you might want to focus on your own problems instead of inventing new ones. You have bigger issues to worry about than ancient history. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone in the darkening apartment. Ancient history? That's what Daniel called their parents' death and the theft of Marcus's future? Ancient history? That night, Marcus made his decision. In the morning, he would call Patricia Williamson back and file a formal fraud inquiry. He would request handwriting analysis of the beneficiary change forms. He would fight for what might be rightfully his, even if it meant destroying what remained of his relationship with his brother. But first, he had one more call to make. Marcus scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for his Aunt Linda, his father's sister, who lived across the country but had stayed in touch with the family over the years. If anyone might have insight into his parents' intentions regarding their estate, it would be Linda. The phone rang 3 times before Linda answered, her voice warm with surprise. Marcus! How are you holding up, sweetheart? I've been thinking about you and Daniel constantly since the funeral. Hi, Aunt Linda. I'm having a really hard time. Oh, honey, Linda said, her tone immediately shifting to concern. What's going on? Are you and Daniel taking care of each other? The question almost made Marcus laugh bitterly. That's actually why I'm calling. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Of course, Marcus. What is it? Marcus took a deep breath. Did our parents ever mention changing their life insurance beneficiaries? Did they ever say anything about leaving everything to Daniel instead of splitting it between us? The silence on Linda's end was different from Daniel's calculating pauses. This felt like genuine surprise and confusion. What are you talking about? Why would they do something like that? Your parents were always so careful about treating you boys equally. In fact, the last time I talked to your father, just a couple months before the accident, he specifically mentioned wanting to make sure you and Daniel would both be financially secure if anything happened to them. Marcus's heart began to race. He said that recently? Yes, it was when you were having trouble in school last year. He was worried about your future, but he said he and your mother were committed to giving both their sons the same opportunities.
He even joked about how your mother made him promise never to play favorites with their life insurance, no matter how frustrated they got with your academic struggles. The room seemed to spin around Marcus. His father had been talking about ensuring equal treatment just months before the supposed beneficiary changes. His mother had made his father promise not to play favorites. Everything Linda was saying contradicted the idea that his parents had voluntarily cut Marcus out of their insurance policies. Linda, Marcus said carefully, if I told you that Daniel received all of our parents' life insurance money and I received nothing, what would you think? I'd think there was a terrible mistake somewhere, Linda replied immediately. Or, she paused, and Marcus could hear the reluctance in her voice. Or, I'd think something very wrong had happened. Marcus, please tell me what's going on. Marcus found himself telling Linda everything.
The months of evasion from Daniel, the discovery of the policy documents, the conversation with the insurance company, Daniel's cold dismissal and implied threats. By the time he finished, Linda was making small sounds of distress and anger. "That son of a bitch," she said finally, her language surprising Marcus because Linda rarely swore. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but if what you're telling me is true, Daniel has stolen from you and dishonored your parents' memory in the most disgusting way possible." "But what if I'm wrong?" Marcus asked. "What if our parents really did change their minds about me?" "They didn't," Linda said firmly. "Your father called me 2 weeks before the accident, Marcus. 2 weeks. He was excited about your community college graduation, proud that you were getting back on track academically. He specifically said that he and your mother felt like they were finally seeing the Marcus they'd always known you could be. He was not talking like a man who had decided to cut you out of his will." The confirmation hit Marcus like a physical relief, validating suspicions he'd been afraid to fully embrace. His parents hadn't abandoned him. They hadn't decided he was worthless or irredeemable. Someone had stolen his inheritance, and that someone was almost certainly his own brother. "What should I do?" Marcus asked. "You should expose him," Linda said without hesitation. "You should contact that insurance company tomorrow and file whatever complaints you need to file. Your parents worked their entire lives to provide security for their children. They don't deserve to have their wishes perverted by a greedy, selfish son who thinks he can get away with fraud." "But Daniel threatens legal action if I pursue this. He has money for lawyers and I don't have anything." "Then we'll find you a lawyer," Linda said. "This type of case, if there's real evidence of fraud, attorneys will sometimes work on contingency. And Marcus, I have some savings. Not a lot, but enough to help you get legal representation if you need it." The offer made Marcus's eyes water. Here was family loyalty, freely offered without conditions or manipulation. Here was what he'd been hoping to find in Daniel, but had been searching in the wrong place. "I don't know how to repay you," Marcus said. "You repay me by getting justice for your parents and yourself. And Marcus, I want you to document everything. Every conversation with Daniel, every interaction with the insurance company, everything. If this goes to court, you'll need a complete record." That night, Marcus began writing everything down. Every evasive conversation with Daniel, every missed appointment, every excuse and delay. The pattern of deception became even clearer when laid out chronologically, a systematic effort to keep Marcus in the dark while Daniel consolidated control over their parents' assets. The next morning, Marcus called Patricia Williamson back. "I'd like to file that formal fraud inquiry," he said. "I'll transfer you to our investigation department. And, Mr. Chen, I hope you get the answers you're looking for." The fraud investigation would take weeks to complete. But it began immediately. Marcus provided his photographs of the policy documents, detailed timelines of Daniel's behavior, and contact information for witnesses like Linda who could speak to their parents' intentions. The insurance company's handwriting experts began analyzing the beneficiary change forms, comparing them to known samples of Helen and Robert Chen's signatures from other documents. During this waiting period, Marcus's life continued its downward spiral. He was evicted from his apartment and had to move his belongings into a storage unit he could barely afford. He stayed on friends' couches when possible, and in his broken car when necessary. He dropped out of school entirely, unable to afford tuition or even transportation to campus. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. Through social media and mutual acquaintances, Marcus learned that his brother had bought a new luxury car, taken expensive vacations, and was looking at investment properties. The casual way Daniel was spending what might be stolen money added insult to the injury of Marcus's homelessness. 3 weeks into the investigation, Patricia Williamson called with preliminary results. "Mr. Chen, I have some significant findings to share with you. Our handwriting experts have identified multiple irregularities in the signatures on the beneficiary change forms." Marcus's heart raced. "What kind of irregularities?" "The signatures appear to be traced or copied rather than naturally written. There are hesitation marks, unnatural letter formations, and pressure variations that suggest someone was attempting to replicate unfamiliar handwriting. Additionally, the paper stock and ink composition don't match other documents from the same time period that we have on file.
So they're fake? Based on our analysis, it appears highly likely that these signatures were forged, Patricia confirmed. We're referring this matter to our fraud investigation team and to local law enforcement. Mr. Chen, I need to inform you that if these findings are confirmed, your brother could face serious criminal charges. The weight of the moment settled over Marcus. This was no longer just about money or family disputes. This is about potential felony fraud, about Daniel facing years in prison, about their family's name being destroyed in criminal court proceedings. Despite everything Daniel had done, Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty about the path he'd chosen. But then he thought about sleeping in his car last night, about dropping out of school, about the months of lies and manipulation. He thought about his parents, who had worked so hard to provide for both their sons, only to have their wishes perverted by the child they'd trusted most. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "We'll be freezing Daniel's access to the insurance funds while the investigation continues," Patricia said. "Any money he's already spent will need to be accounted for. And Marcus, based on our findings, it appears you are entitled to half of the insurance benefits according to the original policy terms." For the first time in months, Marcus allowed himself to feel hope. Not just hope for financial relief, but hope for justice, for validation, for the restoration of his parents' true intentions. The next phase would be the hardest. Daniel would soon discover that his access to the insurance money had been frozen. He would learn about the fraud investigation, possibly from law enforcement officers arriving at his office or home. The brother who had dismissed Marcus as dramatic and irresponsible would face the consequences of his own criminal irresponsibility. Marcus knew that Daniel would fight the charges, would hire expensive attorneys, would probably try to claim that their parents had actually asked him to forge the documents for some legitimate reason. He knew the legal process would be long and painful, potentially lasting years. But as Marcus sat in the insurance company's parking lot after his meeting with Patricia, looking at the documentation that would restore his rightful inheritance, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his parents' death. A sense of belonging to something larger than his own immediate struggles. He belonged to a family legacy that valued fairness, honesty, and taking care of each other. Daniel had betrayed that legacy, but Marcus was going to restore it. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, Marcus could see beyond his immediate crisis. He could envision finishing school, building a career, maybe even starting a family of his own someday. He could imagine honoring his parents' memory through his own choices and values, rather than simply surviving the aftermath of their loss. Most importantly, he could imagine a future where justice prevailed over manipulation, where truth mattered more than convenience, and where family loyalty was defined by genuine care rather than calculated self-interest. It was the kind of future his parents would have wanted for him, and it was the kind of future Daniel's betrayal had nearly stolen. But nearly wasn't the same as actually. The insurance company's call had changed everything, just as Marcus had hoped it would. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility of genuine healing and renewal. The call came at 7 in the morning, jolting Marcus awake in the cramped back seat of his Toyota Camry. The phone's shrill ring echoed through the empty parking lot of the 24-hour diner where he'd spent the night, one of the few places that didn't hassle people for loitering. Detective Sarah Rodriguez identified herself with the kind of calm professionalism that somehow made the gravity of the situation feel both more real and more manageable. "Mr. Chen, I'm calling regarding the insurance fraud investigation involving your brother, Daniel Chen. The Hartwell Insurance Company has forwarded their findings to our department, and we'd like to schedule an interview with you as soon as possible." Marcus sat up carefully, his back aching from another night contorted in the cramped space that had become his temporary bedroom. Through the frost-covered windows, he could see early morning commuters grabbing coffee and breakfast before heading to offices and lives that seemed impossibly normal compared to his current reality. "What kind of interview?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse from sleep and the constant stress that had become his companion.
We need to get your statement regarding the timeline of events, your interactions with your brother since your parents' death, and any evidence you might have that could help us build our case," Detective Rodriguez explained. "This is a complex fraud investigation, Mr. Chen, and your cooperation will be essential to ensuring justice is served." 2 hours later, Marcus sat across from Detective Rodriguez in a sterile interview room at the police station. She was younger than he'd expected, probably early 30s, with sharp eyes and an organized manner that reminded him of his father's methodical approach to problem solving. On the table between them lay printed copies of all the documentation Marcus had photographed, along with additional evidence the insurance company had provided. "Let's start from the beginning," Detective Rodriguez said, activating a digital recorder. "Tell me about your relationship with your brother before your parents' death." Marcus found himself describing a dynamic he'd never fully analyzed before. Daniel had always been the golden child, the achiever, the one who seemed to effortlessly excel at everything he attempted. But beyond the obvious differences in their academic and professional success, there had been subtler patterns of control and manipulation that Marcus was only now recognizing as significant. "Daniel always made decisions for both of us," Marcus explained. "Even as kids, he'd decide what games we played, what movies we watched, how we spent our allowance. My parents saw it as leadership, but looking back, I think it was more about Daniel needing to be in control of every situation." Detective Rodriguez took detailed notes, asking follow-up questions that helped Marcus see his childhood experiences in a new light. The time Daniel convinced him to trade his valuable baseball cards for Daniel's broken electronics, the way Daniel would volunteer both brothers for chores, then find excuses to leave Marcus doing the work alone, the pattern of Daniel making promises he didn't keep, then blaming Marcus for having unrealistic expectations. "After your parents' death, when did you first suspect something might be wrong with the insurance situation?" Detective Rodriguez asked. Marcus walked her through the months of evasion, the canceled meetings, the vague explanations that never quite added up. As he spoke, he realized how obvious the deception seemed in retrospect. Daniel's behavior had been so contrary to his usual efficiency and organization that it should have raised red flags immediately. "Why do you think you didn't recognize the signs earlier?" the detective asked. The question forced Marcus to confront uncomfortable truths about his own psychology. "I think I wanted to believe Daniel was taking care of everything because I couldn't handle taking care of it myself. I was grieving, I was overwhelmed, and it was easier to trust him than to face the possibility that he might be betraying me." Detective Rodriguez nodded with understanding. That's a common response in these types of family fraud cases. The victims often have a psychological investment in trusting the perpetrator, which makes the deception more effective and more damaging when it's finally discovered. She showed Marcus enlarged copies of the forged signature pages, pointing out the specific irregularities that had convinced the handwriting experts of fraud: the traced quality of the letters, the unnatural pen pressure, the slight tremor that suggested someone copying unfamiliar handwriting rather than signing naturally. "We've also discovered some additional evidence," Detective Rodriguez said, pulling out a new folder. "We obtained a warrant to examine Daniel's financial records, and we found some interesting patterns." The documents she spread across the table told a story of financial planning that began months before their parents' death. Daniel had opened new investment accounts, researched luxury purchases, and even put a deposit on a vacation home in Lake Tahoe, all within weeks of the supposed beneficiary change date. "This suggests premeditation," Detective Rodriguez explained. "Your brother wasn't just opportunistically taking advantage of a situation after your parents died.
He appears to have been planning to defraud you for almost a year." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. It was one thing to think that Daniel had acted impulsively after their parents' death, perhaps convincing himself that he deserved the money more than Marcus, but to learn that Daniel had been systematically planning to steal Marcus's inheritance for months made the betrayal feel exponentially more cruel and calculated. "There's something else," Detective Rodriguez continued. "We found evidence that your brother researched methods for forging signatures. His computer browser history shows multiple searches for terms like copying handwriting, signature forgery techniques, and how to avoid handwriting analysis. He also purchased special paper and ink that closely matched what your parents' insurance company had on file. Marcus stared at the evidence, feeling simultaneously vindicated and devastated. Daniel hadn't just made a selfish decision in a moment of grief. He had researched, planned, and executed a sophisticated fraud scheme specifically designed to rob his younger brother of their parents' legacy. "What happens to Daniel now?" Marcus asked. "We'll be executing a search warrant on his home and office today," Detective Rodriguez replied. "Based on the evidence we've gathered, we have probable cause to arrest him on charges of insurance fraud, forgery, and identity theft. Given the amount of money involved and the sophisticated nature of the scheme, he's looking at potential felony charges that could result in several years in prison." The weight of those words settled over Marcus. His brother, the person he'd looked up to his entire life, was about to be arrested as a common criminal. Their family name would be dragged through court proceedings and local news coverage. Future employers would find Daniel's mugshot and criminal record with a simple internet search. "I know this is difficult," Detective Rodriguez said gently, "but you should understand that what your brother did wasn't just theft from you. It was theft from your parents' estate, fraud against the insurance company, and a violation of multiple state and federal laws. This isn't a family dispute that got out of hand. This is serious criminal behavior." After the interview, Marcus sat in his car in the police station parking lot, trying to process everything he'd learned. The evidence was overwhelming, the case seemingly airtight. Daniel would be arrested, would face trial, would likely be convicted and sentenced to prison. Justice would be served, Marcus's inheritance would be restored, and the truth about his parents' intentions would be officially validated. But victory felt hollow when it came at the cost of destroying his only remaining family member. Marcus found himself thinking about Daniel as a child, the older brother who had taught him to ride a bike, who had scared away bullies at school, who had sat by his bedside when he had pneumonia in 3rd grade. How had that protective, caring brother become someone capable of such calculated cruelty? His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. The caller ID showed Linda's number, and Marcus answered gratefully, needing to hear a familiar voice that offered unconditional support. "Marcus, honey, how did it go with the police?" Linda asked immediately. Marcus filled her in on the interview, the additional evidence, the planned arrest. Linda listened with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that mirrored Marcus's own conflicted emotions. "I'm proud of you for seeing this through," Linda said when he finished. "I know it can't be easy, but what you're doing is right. Your parents deserve to have their true wishes honored." "I keep thinking about Daniel as a kid. He wasn't always like this. Something changed him, and I don't understand what or when." Linda was quiet for a moment before responding. "Marcus, I think you might be idealizing your childhood memories of Daniel. From what I observed over the years, he always had controlling tendencies. Your parents just framed them as leadership qualities because they were proud of his achievements." She went on to describe incidents Marcus had forgotten or minimized. The time Daniel had convinced your parents that Marcus was lying about completing his homework, resulting in punishment for Marcus and praise for Daniel's honesty. The way Daniel would subtly undermine Marcus during family gatherings, making jokes that highlighted Marcus's struggles while showcasing his own successes. The pattern of Daniel receiving credit for joint projects and achievements, while Marcus's contributions were overlooked or dismissed. "I tried to bring up my concerns with your parents a few times," Linda continued, "but they saw Daniel's behavior as natural sibling rivalry, and they were so proud of his accomplishments that they didn't want to hear anything that might tarnish that pride." The conversation helped Marcus understand that Daniel's recent actions weren't a departure from his character, but rather an escalation of lifelong patterns. The difference was that now Daniel had access to significant resources and legal knowledge that made his manipulations more sophisticated and damaging. That afternoon, Detective Rodriguez called with an update. "We've executed the search warrants, and we have Daniel in custody. He's been charged with insurance fraud in the 1st degree, multiple counts of forgery, and identity theft. His bail has been set at $500,000. "Did he say anything?" Marcus asked. "He demanded a lawyer immediately and hasn't made any statements. But Mr. Chen, there's something you should know. During the search of his home, we found additional forged documents. It appears your brother may have been planning to forge your parents' wills as well."
The revelation sent chills down Marcus's spine. The insurance fraud had been devastating enough, but the idea that Daniel had been planning to steal from him comprehensively, eliminating any possibility for Marcus to receive anything from their parents' estate, demonstrated a level of greed and callousness that Marcus had never imagined possible. "We found draft versions of amended wills that would have left everything to Daniel," Detective Rodriguez continued. "He hadn't executed this plan yet, probably because he was still working on perfecting the forgery techniques, but the intent was clearly there." Marcus realized how close he had come to losing everything. If he hadn't discovered the insurance fraud when he did, if he hadn't found the courage to investigate and report it, Daniel might have successfully stolen not just the life insurance, but also the house, the investments, and every other asset their parents had accumulated over decades of hard work. The scope of Daniel's betrayal was breathtaking in its completeness. He hadn't just wanted Marcus's share of the insurance money, he had wanted to erase Marcus entirely from their parents' legacy, to claim everything for himself while leaving his younger brother with nothing but debt and grief. That evening, local news stations began reporting on Daniel's arrest. "Prominent business consultant charged with insurance fraud in parents' death benefits scheme," read the headline on Channel 7 News. The story included Daniel's professional photo from his consulting firm's website, making him look successful and respectable, which somehow made his crime seem even more shocking. Marcus watched the coverage from a booth at the same 24-hour diner where he'd been sleeping, nursing a cup of coffee he couldn't really afford while charging his phone. The reporter described Daniel as a trusted family member who allegedly exploited his position to defraud his younger brother of hundreds of thousands of dollars in inheritance. The story also mentioned that the victims were Helen and Robert Chen, beloved local educator and respected engineer, whose tragic deaths in a drunk driving accident had been followed by this additional family trauma. Marcus felt a pang of grief thinking about how his parents would have reacted to seeing their elder son's mugshot on the evening news. Over the following days, the story gained momentum as more details emerged. Local newspapers picked up the case, and social media discussions ranged from sympathy for Marcus to speculation about what could drive someone to defraud their own family.
Daniel's consulting firm issued a statement placing him on indefinite leave pending resolution of the criminal charges. Meanwhile, Marcus began the process of reclaiming his life. With the insurance investigation confirming his rightful claim to half of the benefits, he was able to access emergency funds that allowed him to rent a small studio apartment and re-enroll in community college for the spring semester. The financial relief was enormous, but the emotional healing would take much longer. Linda flew in from the East Coast to provide support during this transitional period. She helped Marcus shop for basic furniture and household items, accompanied him to meetings with insurance representatives and victim advocates, and provided the steady presence of someone who believed in him unconditionally. "Your parents would be so proud of how you've handled this," Linda told him as they assembled a simple dining table in his new apartment. "You could have just accepted Daniel's story and tried to make do with nothing. Instead, you stood up for yourself and for their memory." But Marcus struggled with complicated emotions about his role in Daniel's downfall. Even knowing that Daniel had planned to steal everything, even understanding that his brother's actions were criminal and inexcusable, Marcus felt guilt about the consequences his report had triggered. "I keep thinking about Daniel sitting in jail," Marcus admitted to Linda. "I know he brought this on himself, but he's still my brother. Part of me feels like I should have found a way to resolve this privately." Linda set down her screwdriver and looked at Marcus seriously. "Honey, there was no private resolution possible here. Daniel committed serious crimes against you and against your parents' memory. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars and was planning to steal even more. You didn't put him in jail. His own choices put him in jail." She went on to explain that family loyalty shouldn't extend to covering up criminal behavior, especially when that behavior directly harmed other family members. "Daniel made his choices with full knowledge of the potential consequences. You're not responsible for protecting him from those consequences." The conversation helped Marcus understand that his guilt was a product of years of conditioning to prioritize Daniel's well-being over his own.
Even after discovering the extent of his brother's betrayal, Marcus's first instinct was still to minimize the impact on Daniel rather than focusing on justice for himself and his parents. As the weeks passed, more details about Daniel's financial situation emerged through the legal discovery process. It turned out that Daniel's lifestyle had been financed almost entirely through credit and the stolen insurance money. His luxury car was leased, his expensive apartment was month to month, and his investment portfolio was largely funded by money that legally belonged to Marcus. The prosecution's case against Daniel continued to strengthen as forensic accountants traced the path of the insurance funds through various accounts and investments. Daniel had been careful to avoid patterns that might raise immediate suspicion, but he had also documented his fraudulent activities so thoroughly that the evidence trail was unmistakable. Marcus began attending sessions with a therapist who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse. Dr. Jennifer Walsh helped him understand that what he'd experienced wasn't just theft, but a form of psychological manipulation that had undermined his sense of reality and self-worth. Financial abuse within families often involves gaslighting, Dr. Walsh explained during one of their sessions. The perpetrator doesn't just steal money, they also steal the victim's confidence in their own perceptions and judgment. Your brother spent months convincing you that your legitimate concerns were unfounded, that your needs were unreasonable, that your understanding of the situation was wrong. The therapy sessions helped Marcus recognize patterns in his relationship with Daniel that extended far beyond the insurance fraud. Daniel had always been skilled at making Marcus doubt his own judgment, at framing Marcus's legitimate needs as selfish demands, and positioning himself as the reasonable one while portraying Marcus as dramatic or unrealistic. Understanding these patterns is important for your recovery, Dr. Walsh continued, but it's also important for protecting yourself in future relationships. People who are willing to exploit family members often target individuals who have been conditioned to doubt themselves and prioritize others' needs. Marcus also began attending a support group for victims of family financial abuse, where he met others who had experienced similar betrayals. The stories were heartbreakingly familiar. Trusted family members stealing inheritances, siblings forging documents, adult children manipulating elderly parents out of their life savings. The hardest part isn't losing the money, shared Maria, a woman whose brother had stolen their mother's entire estate. It's losing your faith in family, in trust, in the idea that the people closest to you have your best interests at heart. The group provided a space where Marcus could express his complicated emotions without judgment. Here, he could admit to missing Daniel despite everything, could acknowledge his guilt about the criminal charges, could explore his fears about trusting people in the future. The other members understood these contradictions in ways that well-meaning friends and family members couldn't. Meanwhile, Daniel's legal situation continued to deteriorate. His attorney attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was so overwhelming and the charges so serious that prosecutors were reluctant to offer significant concessions. The forged documents, the computer searches, the financial records, and the attempted will fraud all pointed to a level of premeditation that made Daniel appear to be a sophisticated criminal rather than someone who had made a momentary lapse in judgment. The insurance company completed their internal investigation and officially restored Marcus's benefits, transferring $500,000 to an account in his name. The money represented security, opportunity, and the fulfillment of his parents' intentions, but it also carried the weight of everything he'd lost in the process of claiming it. Marcus used a portion of the funds to hire his own attorney, partly to ensure his interests were protected in the ongoing criminal case, but also to explore the possibility of civil action against Daniel. His lawyer, Catherine Morrison, explained that even after the criminal case was resolved, Marcus might be able to recover additional damages for the emotional distress and financial hardship Daniel's actions had caused. Insurance fraud cases often involve significant punitive damages when there's evidence of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Your brother's actions weren't just theft. They were calculated psychological torture designed to make you doubt your own sanity while he stole your inheritance.
But Marcus found himself reluctant to pursue additional legal action against Daniel. The criminal case would likely result in prison time and permanent damage to Daniel's career and reputation. Adding civil penalties felt like piling on, even though Marcus intellectually understood that Daniel deserved whatever consequences his actions had earned. This reluctance troubled Marcus because he recognized it as another manifestation of the psychological conditioning that had made him vulnerable to Daniel's manipulation in the first place. Even now, even after everything, Marcus's instinct was to protect Daniel from the full consequences of his choices. It's natural to have conflicted feelings, Dr. Walsh assured him during therapy. You're not required to feel pure hatred toward your brother, and you're not required to pursue every legal remedy available to you. But it's important that your decisions come from a place of self-respect rather than from old patterns of self-sacrifice. As winter turned to spring, Marcus began to build a new life with the security his inheritance provided. He transferred to a 4-year university to complete his bachelor's degree in social work, inspired by his experiences with the victim advocates and support groups that had helped him navigate his ordeal. He moved to a nicer apartment closer to campus and bought reliable transportation. But perhaps most importantly, he began to develop relationships based on mutual respect rather than the unequal dynamic he'd accepted with Daniel for so many years. Through his classes and support group, Marcus met people who valued his perspectives, who listened to his concerns without dismissing them, who offered support without attempting to control or manipulate him. The contrast with his relationship with Daniel was striking. Marcus began to understand that what he'd interpreted as normal sibling dynamics had actually been a relationship characterized by emotional abuse and control. Daniel's recent crimes weren't an aberration, but rather the logical extreme of patterns that had been present throughout their lives. 6 months after Daniel's arrest, the criminal case finally went to trial. Marcus testified about his brother's deception, the months of evasion and lies, the discovery of the forged documents. The experience was emotionally difficult, but also empowering, giving Marcus a chance to speak publicly about the impact of Daniel's actions. The defendant didn't just steal money from me, Marcus told the jury during his victim impact statement. He stole my ability to grieve my parents properly. He stole months of my life when I should have been healing and rebuilding. He stole my faith in family loyalty and trust.
The financial damage was severe, but the emotional damage has been even worse. Daniel's defense attorney attempted to portray him as a grieving son who had made poor decisions under extreme stress, but the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Patricia Harrison sentenced Daniel to 4 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after serving 2 years. She also ordered him to pay full restitution to Marcus and to the insurance company, though much of the stolen money had already been spent and would be difficult to recover. "Mr. Chen," Judge Harrison said, addressing Daniel directly during sentencing, "you betrayed the most fundamental bonds of family loyalty and trust. You exploited your brother's grief and vulnerability to enrich yourself at his expense. Your actions represent a calculated cruelty that this court finds particularly reprehensible." Marcus sat in the courtroom gallery as Daniel was led away in handcuffs, feeling a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. Justice had been served, but at the cost of any possibility of reconciliation with his only remaining family member. The brother he'd grown up with, who had taught him to tie his shoes and ride a bicycle, was now a convicted felon who would spend the next several years in prison. After the sentencing, Detective Rodriguez approached Marcus in the courthouse hallway. "I want you to know that your courage in reporting this fraud probably prevented other victims," she said. "Our investigation revealed that your brother had been researching similar schemes involving elderly clients at his consulting firm. If he hadn't been caught and prosecuted, he might have expanded his criminal activities beyond family members." The revelation provided some comfort to Marcus.
helping him understand that his decision to report Daniel had protected not just himself, but potentially other vulnerable people who might have been targeted in the future. Daniel's pattern of exploitation and manipulation might have continued indefinitely if Marcus hadn't found the strength to expose it. As Marcus left the courthouse that day, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that desperate morning when he'd called the insurance company seeking answers about his parents' policies. He'd lost a brother, but gained self-respect. He had endured months of hardship, but emerged with a clearer understanding of his own worth and rights. He discovered the devastating reality of Daniel's betrayal, but also learned that he was capable of standing up for himself even in the most difficult circumstances. The money his parents had left him would provide security and opportunity for years to come. But perhaps more importantly, the experience of fighting for that inheritance had taught Marcus that he deserved to be treated with respect and honesty, that his needs and feelings mattered, and that he had the strength to protect himself when necessary. Walking away from the courthouse that day, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since before his parents' death: hope for the future. Not just hope for financial stability or academic success, but hope for relationships built on genuine care and mutual respect. Hope for a life where he wouldn't have to doubt his own perceptions or apologize for having needs. Hope for honoring his parents' memory through his own choices, rather than simply surviving the aftermath of their loss. The insurance company's call had indeed changed everything, just as Marcus had hoped it would. But the most important changes weren't financial. They were internal transformations that had given Marcus the tools to build a life worthy of his parents' love and sacrifice. A life that Daniel's betrayal had nearly stolen, but couldn't ultimately destroy. 2 years after Daniel's sentencing, Marcus stood in the graduation ceremony arena at San Francisco State University, adjusting his cap and gown while scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Linda sat in the third row, beaming with pride, and holding a bouquet of flowers that would have made his mother cry with joy. Next to her sat Dr. Walsh, his therapist, who had become not just a professional advisor, but a genuine mentor and friend. Behind them, Marcus spotted several members of his support group, people who had become his chosen family through shared experiences of betrayal and recovery. The transformation from that desperate young man sleeping in his car to this graduating senior with a 3.8 GPA and social work felt surreal. Marcus had completed his degree in just 2.5 years, driven by a sense of purpose that hadn't existed before his parents' death and Daniel's betrayal. Every challenging assignment, every late-night study session, every moment of doubt had been sustained by his determination to build something meaningful from the wreckage of his family. As the ceremony began and names were called in alphabetical order, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The insurance money had provided the foundation for his education, but the real work of rebuilding his life had required emotional labor that no amount of money could purchase. Learning to trust his own judgment after years of gaslighting, developing healthy relationships after growing up with manipulation as the dominant family dynamic, finding ways to honor his parents' memory while forging his own identity separate from Daniel's shadow. When his name was called, Marcus walked across the stage with steady confidence, accepting his diploma from the dean with a firm handshake and genuine smile. The applause from his chosen family felt warmer and more meaningful than any recognition he had received during his childhood, when praise had often come with conditions or comparisons to Daniel's achievements. After the ceremony, Linda enveloped him in a fierce hug that lasted nearly a minute. "Your parents would be so incredibly proud," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for your academic success, but for the man you've become. You've taken their worst nightmare and turned it into something beautiful." Dr. Walsh approached with her characteristic blend of professional pride and personal warmth. "Marcus, I've watched you grow from someone who couldn't trust his own perceptions to someone who advocates for others with absolute conviction. Your parents gave you strong foundations, but you built this strength yourself." The graduation party that evening was held in Marcus's apartment, a comfortable 2-bedroom space near campus that felt like home in ways the family house never had. The guests were people Marcus had chosen rather than inherited, relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than blood obligation or social expectation. Among the attendees was Sarah Martinez, a fellow social work student who had become Marcus's closest friend and, recently, romantic partner. Sarah understood trauma from her own experiences growing up in an abusive household, and their relationship was characterized by honest communication and mutual support rather than the power dynamics that had defined Marcus's family relationships. "I'm proud of you for more than just graduating," Sarah told him as they stood on his apartment balcony, looking out over the city lights. "You've learned to celebrate your own achievements without needing someone else's permission or approval. That's not something they teach in textbooks." The observation struck Marcus as profoundly true. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, his accomplishments had always been filtered through his parents' reactions or compared to Daniel's achievements. Now, for the first time, he was experiencing the pure satisfaction of personal accomplishment without the complicated dynamics of family approval or sibling competition. The next morning brought news that would test Marcus's emotional progress in unexpected ways. Detective Rodriguez called to inform him that Daniel was being released on parole after serving 2 years of his 4-year sentence. The early release was standard for nonviolent felons with good behavior records, but it meant that Daniel would soon be back in the same city, attempting to rebuild his own life after prison. "He's required to maintain no contact with you as part of his parole conditions," Detective Rodriguez explained. "But I wanted you to be aware of his release in case you encounter him accidentally or if he attempts to reach out through third parties." The news triggered a complex emotional response that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Despite everything Daniel had done, despite the criminal conviction and the years of therapy, Marcus still felt a pang of something that might have been concern for Daniel's well-being. The conditioning of childhood loyalty runs deep, even when it conflicts with adult understanding of justice and self-protection. Marcus discussed his feelings with Dr. Walsh during their regular session the next week. "It's normal to have complicated emotions about someone who is both family and perpetrator," she assured him. "Your concern for Daniel's well-being doesn't mean you should compromise your own safety or healing. It just means that you're a person capable of compassion even toward those who have hurt you." They talked about strategies for maintaining healthy boundaries if Marcus encountered Daniel either accidentally or through deliberate contact attempts. Dr. Walsh emphasized that Marcus's primary obligation was to himself and his own continued healing, not to helping Daniel adjust to life after prison. "You've built a strong foundation for your new life. Don't let guilt or misplaced loyalty undermine your progress," she said. Meanwhile, Marcus had begun his career as a victim advocate at the San Francisco Family Justice Center, working with people who had experienced various forms of family abuse and exploitation. His own experiences with financial fraud and psychological manipulation made him particularly effective at helping clients navigate the complex emotions of betrayal by trusted family members.
His supervisor, Maria Santos, had hired Marcus specifically because of his background. Survivors helping survivors is one of the most powerful forms of advocacy, she explained during his first week. You understand these dynamics from the inside in ways that academic training alone can't provide. Marcus's first major case involved an elderly woman named Ruth Patterson, whose adult son had been stealing from her retirement accounts for years. The parallels to his own situation were striking, though Ruth's case involved ongoing financial abuse rather than a single massive theft. Like Marcus, Ruth struggled with conflicted feelings about her son's criminal behavior and felt guilt about involving law enforcement in family matters. "I keep thinking I should have been smarter," Ruth confided during one of their meetings. "I should have known what was happening. I should have protected myself better." Marcus recognized the self-blame that had characterized his own early response to Daniel's betrayal. "You trusted someone you loved," he told Ruth gently. "That's not stupidity. That's normal human behavior. The fault lies with the person who chose to exploit that trust, not with you for having it." Working with Ruth and other clients helped Marcus understand his own experience in broader context. Family financial abuse was far more common than most people realized, often involving sophisticated manipulation techniques that made detection difficult even for intelligent, capable victims. The shame and self-blame he had experienced were universal responses to this particular form of betrayal. His work also involved educating other professionals about the dynamics of family financial abuse. Marcus began speaking at conferences and training sessions,
sharing his story as a way to help lawyers, social workers, and law enforcement officers better understand the psychological complexity of these cases. When someone steals from a family member, Marcus would explain to his audiences, they're not just taking money, they're stealing the victim's sense of safety, their ability to trust their own judgment, and their faith in family relationships. Recovery requires addressing all of these losses, not just the financial damage. The speaking engagements were emotionally challenging, but professionally rewarding. Each time Marcus told his story, he met other survivors who felt less alone in their experiences. He also encountered professionals who gained new understanding of how to support family abuse victims more effectively. One particularly meaningful speaking engagement was at a conference for insurance industry professionals, where Marcus met Patricia Williamson, the claims representative who had first confirmed the fraud investigation. She had followed his story through the legal proceedings and was moved to see how he had transformed his traumatic experience into meaningful advocacy work. "Your case changed how our company approaches potential fraud situations," Patricia told him after his presentation. "We now have specific protocols for family fraud cases that emphasize the importance of believing victims and providing emotional support throughout the investigation process." Learning that his experience had led to systemic changes that might help other victims gave Marcus a sense of purpose that transcended his personal healing. His parents' deaths and Daniel's betrayal had been senseless tragedies, but the advocacy work that emerged from those experiences was creating positive change in the world. 6 months after Daniel's release from prison, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Linda. Daniel had contacted her asking if she would serve as an intermediary for a potential conversation with Marcus. Daniel claimed to want to apologize and make amends, though he couldn't contact Marcus directly due to the restraining order. "I told him I'd pass along his request, but I made it clear that the decision is entirely yours. You don't owe him anything, Marcus. Not forgiveness, not a conversation, not even acknowledgement of his existence." The request forced Marcus to confront questions he'd been avoiding since Daniel's release. Was he ready to hear his brother's apology? Did Daniel deserve the opportunity to attempt amends? Would such a conversation help Marcus's continued healing, or potentially undermine his progress? Marcus spent several therapy sessions exploring these questions with Dr. Walsh. They discussed the difference between forgiveness as a personal process of letting go of anger and forgiveness as reconciliation with the person who had caused harm. Dr. Walsh emphasized that Marcus could achieve the former without engaging in the latter. Forgiveness, in the sense of releasing your own anger and resentment, is something you do for yourself, but reconciliation requires trust rebuilding, which is something Daniel would need to earn through consistent, reliable behavior over time. You're not obligated to provide him with opportunities to earn that trust. After careful consideration, Marcus decided that he wasn't ready for direct contact with Daniel, regardless of his brother's stated intentions. The life he had built was stable, meaningful, and healthy. Engaging with Daniel carried the risk of reopening wounds that had taken years to heal, with no guarantee that such engagement would be beneficial for anyone involved. Marcus asked Linda to communicate his decision to Daniel, along with a message that any future contact attempts should go through legal channels. He also updated his security arrangements, informing his employer and apartment building management about the potential for unwanted contact from Daniel. The decision brought a sense of relief that confirmed its correctness. Marcus realized that he had no desire to resume any kind of relationship with Daniel, even a limited one mediated by therapists or family members. The person who had been his brother was incompatible with the life Marcus had built for himself. Maintaining that separation was an act of self-care, not vindictiveness. Around this time, Marcus made another significant decision about his future. Sarah had been offered a position with a victim advocacy organization in Portland, Oregon, and she asked Marcus if he would consider relocating with her. The opportunity would mean leaving behind the familiar surroundings where he had rebuilt his life, but it would also represent a fresh start in a place with no connections to his traumatic past. After discussing the possibility with Dr. Walsh and Linda, Marcus decided to make the move. His work experience in San Francisco had prepared him for similar positions elsewhere, and the relationship with Sarah had become a central source of joy and stability in his life. Most importantly, the decision felt like a choice made from strength rather than a retreat from the past.
The farewell party his colleagues threw for Marcus was attended by dozens of people whose lives he had touched through his advocacy work. Former clients, professional colleagues, support group members, and friends gathered to celebrate his contributions to their community and wish him well in his new adventure. "You've shown all of us what it looks like to transform pain into purpose," Maria Santos said during the evening speeches. "Your parents would be amazed to see how you've honored their memory by helping others find their own strength." The move to Portland went smoothly, and Marcus quickly found work with the Oregon Family Crisis Center, where his reputation as an effective advocate had preceded him. He and Sarah found a small house in a quiet neighborhood, their first shared living space, and a symbol of the healthy, equal partnership they had built together. The distance from San Francisco provided psychological benefits Marcus hadn't expected. Being in a new city where no one knew his history as Daniel's brother or the victim of family fraud allowed him to inhabit his identity as simply Marcus Chen, social worker and advocate. The past remained part of his story, but it no longer defined his daily existence. On the third anniversary of his parents' deaths, Marcus and Sarah visited a local botanical garden to mark the occasion with beauty and growth rather than grief and loss. Marcus had developed this ritual during his second year of college, finding that celebrating his parents' love of nature and growth was more healing than traditional cemetery visits focused on death and endings. As they walked among the flowering trees and carefully tended gardens, Marcus reflected on how different his life had become from anything he might have imagined during those desperate months after his parents' deaths. The insurance money had provided the foundation for his education and career, but the real transformation had come through his own emotional work and the relationships he had chosen to cultivate. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Daniel hadn't done what he did?" Sarah asked as they sat by a fountain watching families with children feed ducks in a nearby pond. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think I might have stayed stuck in old patterns longer," he said finally. "I was so used to letting Daniel make decisions for both of us, to doubting my own judgment whenever it conflicted with his. His betrayal forced me to develop independence and self-trust in ways I might never have achieved otherwise."
Without Daniel's fraud, Marcus might never have discovered his passion for advocacy work. He might never have developed the self-confidence to build healthy relationships or the clarity to recognize manipulation when he encountered it. "I'm not grateful for what he did," Marcus clarified. "The pain he caused was real and unnecessary. But I'm grateful for who I became in response to it." That evening, Marcus received an unexpected email from someone he didn't recognize initially. The sender identified herself as Jessica Chen, Daniel's ex-wife, whom Marcus had met only briefly during family gatherings before the divorce that had preceded their parents' death by about a year. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out," Jessica wrote. "I've been following your advocacy work through mutual friends, and I wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. I also wanted to apologize for not speaking up during Daniel's trial. I had information about his controlling behavior that might have helped your case, but I was afraid of getting involved." The email went on to describe Jessica's own experiences with Daniel's manipulation and financial control during their marriage. She had left him after discovering that he had been hiding money and making major financial decisions without her input, behavior that now seemed like practice for the fraud he would later commit against Marcus. "Reading about your case helped me understand that what I experienced wasn't just marital problems, but a pattern of financial abuse," Jessica continued. "I've started therapy to work through those experiences, and I wanted to thank you for speaking so openly about family financial abuse. It helped me recognize my own situation for what it was." Marcus was moved by Jessica's message and wrote back to thank her for sharing her experiences. Their brief correspondence provided another piece of the puzzle of Daniel's behavior, confirming that the fraud against Marcus hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of financial manipulation and control. The exchange also reinforced Marcus's understanding of how common family financial abuse was and how difficult it could be for victims to recognize and report. Jessica's silence during Daniel's trial hadn't been cowardice, but rather a common response to trauma that Marcus now understood more fully through his professional work. As Marcus settled into his new life in Portland, he began planning his next major professional goal, writing a book about family financial abuse that would serve as both memoir and practical guide. The book would tell his story while providing resources for other victims and education for professionals who might encounter such cases. The writing process was emotionally challenging, requiring Marcus to revisit painful memories he had processed in therapy but hadn't examined in such detail. However, the work also felt like a natural extension of his advocacy efforts, a way to reach even more people who might benefit from understanding these dynamics. Sarah supported the project enthusiastically, sometimes serving as a sounding board for difficult passages or research assistant for the practical resource sections. Her background in trauma counseling provided valuable perspective on how to present sensitive information in ways that would be helpful rather than triggering for readers. Your story has the power to change lives, Sarah told him during one of their evening writing sessions. Not just because of what happened to you, but because of how you've chosen to respond to it. That's the real message people need to hear. The book proposal was accepted by a university press that specialized in social justice topics, and Marcus began the intensive process of expanding his outline into a full manuscript. The advance was modest, but the opportunity to reach a wider audience with his message felt more valuable than financial compensation. During the writing process, Marcus was contacted by a producer for a national news program who was developing a segment on family financial fraud. The producer had learned about Marcus's case through his speaking engagements and wanted to feature his story as part of a broader investigation into the prevalence and impact of such crimes. Marcus agreed to participate, seeing it as another opportunity to raise awareness and potentially help other victims recognize their situations. The interview was conducted at his workplace, emphasizing his transformation from victim to advocate rather than focusing solely on the traumatic aspects of his experience. When the segment aired 6 months later, Marcus was struck by how different he looked and sounded compared to old photos from before his parents' death. The confident, articulate advocate speaking on television bore little resemblance to the uncertain, grief-stricken young man Daniel had manipulated so easily. The visual evidence of his transformation was both satisfying and slightly startling. The television appearance generated significant response, including calls and emails from other family fraud victims seeking guidance and support. Marcus found himself serving as an informal consultant for people across the country who were dealing with situations similar to his own experience. One particularly meaningful contact came from a young woman named Amy, whose older sister had stolen their grandmother's entire estate through forged documents. Amy's situation was remarkably similar to Marcus's experience, down to the family dynamics that had made the victim vulnerable to manipulation by a trusted sibling. Reading about your case gave me the courage to report my sister to the police. I thought I was crazy for suspecting her, but your story helped me understand that my doubts were actually good instincts. The investigation proved that the will was forged, just like your insurance policies. Correspondence with Amy and other victims reinforced Marcus's commitment to his advocacy work and writing project. Each person who found hope or validation through his story represented a meaningful return on the investment of pain and struggle that had brought him to this point in his life. 5 years after Daniel's conviction, Marcus's book was published to positive reviews and steady sales within its niche market. Stolen Trust, A Family Journey Through Financial Fraud and Recovery, became a recommended resource for victim advocates, family lawyers, and insurance professionals dealing with similar cases. The book launch event was held at a bookstore in Portland, attended by colleagues, friends, clients, and other advocates from around the region. Linda flew in for the occasion, as did Dr. Walsh and several members of Marcus's original support group from San Francisco. The gathering felt like a celebration not just of the book, but of the community Marcus had built around shared values of healing and mutual support. During his reading from the book's final chapter, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. My parents wanted to leave their children with security and opportunity, he read. Daniel tried to steal that legacy for himself, but he couldn't steal the values they taught me or the strength they helped me develop. In the end, their true inheritance wasn't money, but the foundation they gave me to build a meaningful life. The applause that followed felt like validation not just from the audience, but from his parents themselves, wherever they might be. Marcus had taken their worst fears for their family and transformed them into something that honored their memory while helping others avoid similar pain. After the event, Sarah approached him with a small wrapped gift. Inside was a framed photo of Marcus speaking at a recent conference, surrounded by advocates and survivors whose lives had been touched by his work. Below the photo was a quote from his book. "Healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened, it means choosing what happens next. This is who you really are," Sarah said softly. "Not Daniel's victim, not your parents' grieving son, but someone who creates hope from pain and purpose from loss. I'm so proud to share this life with you." As Marcus looked at the photo, he saw not just his own transformation, but the faces of everyone who had supported that journey. Linda, who had provided unwavering family loyalty when his blood family failed him. Dr. Walsh, who had guided him through the complexities of trauma recovery. His support group members, who had shown him he wasn't alone in his experiences. His colleagues and clients, who had given his advocacy work meaning and impact. Most importantly, he saw Sarah, whose love had shown him what healthy relationships look like, and whose partnership had proven that trust could be rebuilt after betrayal. Together, they had created something Daniel's fraud couldn't touch. A life built on authentic connection rather than manipulation, on mutual respect rather than power dynamics, on shared growth rather than competition. Walking home from the bookstore that night, Marcus felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or justice, and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. Daniel's betrayal had been intended to destroy Marcus's future, but instead it had become the foundation for a life more meaningful than anything Marcus might have built without that catalyst. The insurance money was long since invested and growing steadily, providing the security his parents had intended. But their true legacy lived in the work Marcus did every day, helping other families heal from betrayal and abuse, speaking truth about dynamics that thrive in silence and shame, building communities of support for people who had been isolated by trauma. He had kept his promise to honor his parents' memory, though not in ways any of them could have imagined when they were alive. Their deaths had been senseless, but the life Marcus built from that loss had meaning that would outlast any individual tragedy or triumph. As Marcus and Sarah reached their front door, he realized he was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people who chose to love him rather than people obligated to do so by blood or law. The family he had built for himself was healthier than the one he had inherited, and the future he was creating honored his past without being imprisoned by it.